You have watched a country get sanctioned, and you have watched that country's government still standing 5, 10, 20 years later. You have noticed this pattern. It is not your imagination, and it is not a coincidence. It is a structural feature of how economic coercion actually functions, and almost nobody explains it to you before the next round of sanctions gets announced with the same confident language as the last one. Here is the real axis of this argument. Sanctions are not primarily a tool for changing a government's behavior. They are a tool for managing a domestic political audience while avoiding war. That distinction sounds cynical. It is not, it is structural. Once you see it, you cannot watch a sanctions announcement the same way again. The official narrative says sanctions are coercive pressure, squeeze the economy, squeeze the leadership, force a policy change. The structural reality, documented across a century of cases, is that sanctions rarely produce that outcome, and the governments imposing them often know it going in. Robert A. Pape, in his 1997 International Security article, Why Economic Sanctions Do Not Work, went back through the canonical dataset of 20th century sanctions episodes and reclassified them by strict criteria. Did the sanctions actually cause the policy change, or did something else? His finding: sanctions succeeded in roughly 1 in 20 cases. Not 1 in 3. 1 in 20. That number matters because it directly contradicts the number most policymakers cite. Gary Clyde Huffbauer, Jeffrey Scott, and Kimberly Ann Elliott, in their long-running study Economic Sanctions Reconsidered, first published in 1985 and revised across multiple editions, coded historical sanctions episodes and found a success rate closer to 1 in 3. The gap between those two numbers is not a rounding error. It is a fight over what success even means, and that fight tells you something about why sanctions keep getting imposed anyway. You are watching a debate that never fully resolved, and both sides have kept building policy on top of it. The coercion illusion. Picture the moment a sanctions package gets announced. A foreign minister stands at a podium. The language is definitive: this will not stand, there will be consequences. What you are watching is not a policy mechanism being calibrated. It is a signal being sent, and the signal has at least two audiences: the target government and the sanctioning government's own public. Daniel W. Dresner, in The Sanctions Paradox 1999, built a strategic model around this and arrived at a counterintuitive finding. Sanctions work best against allies and close trading partners, and worst against adversaries. The logic is not complicated once it is named. A target state's willingness to concede depends on how much it values its future relationship with the sanctioning state. An ally has something to preserve. An adversary already assumes the relationship is adversarial and has less to lose by holding firm. But the states that actually get sanctioned in practice are overwhelmingly adversaries: Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Russia, Syria. The exact category of target Dresner's model says sanctions are least likely to move. This is the paradox in the title. The tool is being aimed most often at the targets least likely to respond to it. You have sensed this every time a new Iran sanctions package gets announced with the same rhetorical certainty as the last one, and Tehran's posture does not shift. Now you know what that recurring non-response actually reflects: not failure of implementation, but a structural mismatch between the tool and the target baked in from the start. The interwar origin you were never taught. Sanctions, as a coordinated multilateral tool, did not emerge from Cold War statecraft. They were born out of the ashes of the First World War, and their original purpose was not punishment, it was deterrence of war itself. Nicholas Mulder's The Economic Weapon: The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War 2022 traces this origin with precision. The architects of the League of Nations Covenant, drafting Article 16 in 1919, believed they had found something better than war, a mechanism so economically devastating that no rational state would risk triggering it. Woodrow Wilson described the concept as something more terrible than military force, a weapon that could starve a nation into submission without a single soldier crossing a border. Then came the test case. In 1935, Italy invaded Abyssinia. The League imposed sanctions, but critically, it left oil off the list, fearing that an oil embargo would push Italy toward war with Britain and France directly. Mulder's account shows the sanctions as leaky, partial, and ultimately unable to stop the invasion. Italy annexed Abyssinia in 1936. The League's central deterrent tool had been tested in its founding decade and had visibly failed. But the more consequential piece is this. Mulder's book argues that the sanctions did not simply fail to stop aggression. They actively shaped the strategic thinking of the states that would go on to start the Second World War. Germany and Japan watched what happened to a power cut off from global trade and concluded that economic self-sufficiency, autarky, was not optional. It was existential. The drive for Lebensraum in the East and the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere in the Pacific were, in Mulder's reading, partly a direct response to the demonstrated vulnerability of import-dependent economies to blockade. The tool designed to prevent the next war may have helped convince its eventual instigators that territorial conquest for resource security was not paranoia, it was prudent planning. This is the structural mirror worth sitting with. A tool built to punish or deter aggression can, under the wrong conditions, teach the targeted state exactly the lesson that produces more of it. What happens inside the target state? You are watching a sanctioned economy from the outside, reading headlines about currency collapse and shortages, and you assume the leadership is under existential pressure. Often the opposite is happening. Sanctions restrict the flow of goods across a border. Someone still has to decide who gets access to the goods that do get through, who gets the import licenses, who controls the smuggling routes, who is allocated the scarce foreign currency. In a sanctioned economy, that gatekeeping power concentrates in the hands of the state and its loyal networks. Scarcity becomes a resource the regime distributes, and distribution is patronage. Iraq, under UN sanctions through the 1990s, is the starkest documented case. The sanctions regime, intended to pressure Saddam Hussein's government after the invasion of Kuwait, instead produced a well-documented humanitarian catastrophe among the civilian population, while the regime itself built parallel smuggling economies, oil for food diversion, cross-border trade with neighboring states, black market networks controlled by regime loyalists. The oil for food program, meant to relieve civilian suffering while keeping the sanctions regime intact, became its own scandal of diverted funds and kickbacks. The people bearing the cost of the sanctions and the people making the decisions the sanctions were meant to change were not, in practice, the same people. Here is what that pattern actually produced: a policy community that spent the following decade trying to redesign sanctions to avoid repeating it. The shift toward smart sanctions or targeted sanctions in the late 1990s and 2000s, asset freezes on specific individuals, travel bans on named officials, rather than blanket trade embargoes, emerged directly out of the Iraq experience. The Interlaken process, a series of expert consultations beginning in 1998, was explicitly designed to find mechanisms that would pressure decision-makers without starving populations. Whether targeted sanctions actually solved the underlying problem or simply made the mechanism less visible remains contested. But the redesign itself tells you that the people building these tools recognized the first version was hitting the wrong target. The boomerang. Immersive for a moment, you are standing in a European city in the autumn of 2022 and your heating bill has tripled. You did not invade anyone. You are not a policymaker. You are watching your own government's sanctions policy arrive at your door as a cost, not an abstraction. This is the boomerang effect, and it is not new. It has a precedent stretching back to Napoleon's continental system of 1806, a blockade designed to cut Britain off from European trade and strangle its economy into submission. The system required near-total European compliance to work, and it never achieved it. Smuggling networks flourished, Allied states resented the enforced sacrifice, and the economic pain fell heavily on the continental economies enforcing the blockade, not just on the intended target. France's own economy absorbed significant costs, enforcing a policy meant to hurt someone else. The tool designed to isolate an adversary ended up partially isolating its architect. The 2022 sanctions on Russian energy exports following the invasion of Ukraine produced a modern echo of the same dynamic. European economies that had built decades of dependency on Russian natural gas faced an energy price shock that hit European households and industry directly, even as the policy's stated target was Moscow. Meanwhile, Russia adapted, rerouting oil exports through what analysts and journalists covering maritime shipping have called a shadow fleet, aging tankers operating with obscured ownership and flags of convenience, moving crude to buyers in India and China at prices near or above the G7-imposed price cap. The cap was designed to limit Russian oil revenue while keeping Russian oil flowing to prevent a global supply shock. Evasion through the shadow fleet has been extensively documented as undermining that ceiling in practice. And history has a precise name for what comes next in cases like this: sanctions-driven adaptation. A targeted economy does not simply absorb pressure passively. It reroutes, reprices, and rebuilds trade relationships around the restriction. Russian agricultural production, for instance, expanded significantly after the 2014 Crimea-related sanctions and the retaliatory Russian counter-sanctions on Western food imports, as domestic producers filled a market gap created by the policy itself. A tool meant to weaken an economy can, under specific conditions, accelerate a targeted sector's self-sufficiency. The loyalty that sanctions manufacture. You have probably noticed that sanctioned leaders rarely apologize on television, and their domestic approval, at least in the short term, often rises rather than falls. This is not spin. It is a documented political science, finding sometimes called the rally-round-the-flag effect, and it recurs across sanctioned states with different ideologies, different regions, and different histories. The mechanism is straightforward once it is named. Sanctions imposed by a foreign power are easy to frame domestically as external aggression rather than deserved consequence. A government facing sanctions can point to the sanctioning state as the source of hardship, deflecting responsibility for a war, a rights violation, or an economic failure that may have been substantially self-inflicted. Cuba's government has run this narrative for over 6 decades under the U.S. embargo, the longest-running sanctions regime of the post-war era, using the embargo as a central legitimating story for internal hardship, regardless of the regime's own economic policy choices. The embargo has not produced regime change. It has, according to many Cuba scholars, provided a durable external explanation the government can lean on indefinitely. North Korea offers the starker modern case. Decades of increasingly comprehensive UN and US sanctions have not altered the regime's nuclear posture. Instead, North Korea has built an entire alternative revenue architecture around sanctions evasion, state-sponsored cyber theft, targeting cryptocurrency exchanges, documented by UN panel of experts reports, and Western cybersecurity researchers, alongside ship-to-ship coal and oil transfers at sea designed to obscure the origin and destination of sanctioned cargo. The regime did not simply endure the sanctions. It restructured its entire economic model around circumventing them, and that restructuring has, if anything, deepened the state's control over what economic activity remains. The deeper question, the one most coverage never reaches, is why sanctions keep getting imposed at this rate, with this confidence, given a documented track record this week. The answer is not policy failure. It is that changing the target's behavior was never the only objective, and in many cases was not even the primary one. Megan O'Sullivan's research on sanctions against Iran and Iraq points to the domestic political function sanctions serve for the sanctioning government, a visible, low-cost, non-military response to a crisis that satisfies a domestic audience demanding action without the risks of military engagement. Sanctions announcements let a government demonstrate resolve to its own electorate on a compressed timeline, while the actual policy effect on the target unfolds, if it unfolds at all, over years or decades that outlast most news cycles and most electoral terms. This is the gap between the official narrative and the structural reality. Sanctions are marketed as coercion of the target, but they function, in large part, as reassurance for the sanctioning public. This is not a moral failing. It is a structural incentive. A head of government facing a crisis abroad has a narrow menu of options between military force and total inaction, and sanctions occupy that middle space precisely because they are visible, fast to announce, and politically costless in the short run. Regardless of whether the underlying strategic logic, the security dilemma between the sanctioning and sanctioned states, is actually altered by the measure. The reframe. What looked like a repeating cycle of failed policy is, once you have the framework, a legible pattern with its own internal logic. Sanctions are not primarily a coercion mechanism. They are a signaling mechanism with coercive branding, deployed inside a domestic political economy that rewards visible action over patient strategy and absorbed by target states that have, across a century of cases, repeatedly demonstrated the capacity to adapt, redirect trade, consolidate internal control, and convert external pressure into a domestic narrative of resilience. Balance of power logic explains why the states most often sanctioned adversaries with limited existing integration into the sanctioning bloc's economy have the least to lose and the most political incentive to hold firm. The security dilemma explains why sanctioned states often respond to economic pressure by accelerating the very behaviors, military buildup, resource self-sufficiency, alternative payment systems, that sanctions were meant to discourage, because pressure from outside reads internally as confirmation that self-reliance is necessary for survival. You can watch this playing out now in the acceleration of de-dollarization discourse among BRICS states and the surge in central bank gold accumulation since 2022, a direct, traceable response to the demonstrated willingness of Western governments to freeze a rival central bank's reserves, in Russia's case, close to $300 billion immobilized since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, according to G7 and Brookings Institution. States watching that precedent are not concluding the dollar system is safe to depend on. They are concluding the opposite and building alternatives accordingly. The close. Sanctions will keep being announced with the same confident, decisive language, because that language serves a domestic political function independent of whether the underlying policy achieves its stated aim. The target state will very often adapt rather than capitulate. The regime under pressure will frequently emerge with its internal control intact or strengthened, and the population bearing the cost will rarely be the population making the decisions the sanctions were meant to change. This is not cynicism. It is the structural logic of economic coercion, tested across a century of cases from the League of Nations to the present. You will watch the next sanctions announcement differently now. You will hear the certainty in the language, and you will know what that certainty is actually calibrated to produce. If this reframed how you're reading current events, the next video goes into a dynamic in the Taiwan Strait that almost no mainstream coverage has mapped correctly. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.